Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Since we had a bit of a week break for Thanksgiving, I hope everyone had a lovely holiday. I'm Laura Goldman. I am the dietitian working with Premier Weight Loss and presenting another one of these webinars for you tonight. And the theme continues since we're in the holiday season. And what better way to start out than to start talking about holiday drinks? And hopefully we can find a few that won't derail your goals because there can be a surprising amount of sugar and calories that maybe you weren't expecting. And while we're primarily focus on alcoholic beverages, I will touch on a little bit of the non-alcoholic beverages and some non-alcoholic options as well. And as we say every week, as the adage here, remember it is the quality of your calories that matters. And as you may be aware, considering that many holiday drinks can be high in sugar, maybe fat or calories, we really want to make sure that we are paying attention to how much quality over quantity we're getting. So this evening, we'll be touching on why it's so important to monitor your holiday drinks, especially with being on a GLP-1 medication. I do have an outline of what the calorie and sugar content are in some classic holiday beverages. I also have some suggested changes to alter some of the recipes for the classic drinks, but also touch on some other ideas that you could incorporate that still have maybe that holiday feel. And also during your gatherings, a few sipping strategies to try and make sure that you are moderating intake and some ways to help avoid overindulgence. As always, I like to leave time for your questions at the end, and I hope you find this helpful and informative. So to briefly touch on first is this GLP-1 and beverage challenge that you may encounter. And the main issue here is that it's easier to drink your calories. And this is the case for anybody on GLP-1 medications or not. This was also anecdotally reported when people would get the lap band procedure. Sometimes they would struggle because they would drink their calories rather than eat them and be frustrated by the lack of progress that they were making. So that is one complication in that it is easier to drink your calories even when you have that appetite suppressing effect of the GLP-1 medications. And because it's so easy and because those liquids move through us more quickly, we don't necessarily feel as full and we don't feel full for as long. Also, if it's an alcoholic beverage, your tolerance may be lower, and alcohol can have an impact on blood sugar for some people. And I'll touch on some of these a little more in depth as we go on, but I wanted to touch on that. All that being said, I did think it's very interesting that there have been anecdotal, but also reports in some studies where GLP-1 medications may lead to actually a reduced interest as well as reduced intake of alcohol. So there can be some benefits there if some people had a habit of overindulging and suddenly they're not feeling that drive to overindulge quite as much. It doesn't happen to everybody, but I believe it was somewhere around 43% of respondents in a survey had mentioned a decreased interest and intake of alcohol. And that's no small figure there. As I said, I wanted to touch on what we're looking at when we're talking about calories and also sugar with some of these classic beverages. I have to have a range for some of these, of course, because there are a multitude of different recipes out there, so your mileage may vary. But classic eggnog and with rum, you can expect somewhere from 300 to 400 calories and a really pretty big wallop of sugar, about 25 to 35 grams. I didn't want to leave Starbucks out, of course, so even if we're going non-alcoholic and you're having a coffee beverage. The holiday drinks tend to pack a bit of a punch as well. This peppermint mocha grande has over 54 grams of sugar in a serving, which is, again, a pretty surprising amount. And I did take a look. I couldn't find a sugar-free peppermint syrup in their offerings this time around. So for someone who insists on having a peppermint mocha, one of the best suggestions in that kind of case is to have the smallest size possible and do a very rare treat. But hopefully we can try and find some other choices and not have to necessarily choose the sugar-laden peppermint mocha. Also, mulled wine, we can see while it is a bit lower in calories than the other ones here, it's about 200 to 250 with, again, 15 to 20 grams sugar. It kind of beats out the rest of the competition just simply because of the ingredients, but it still can pack a punch. And then hot buttered rum, you can see somewhere between 300 and 400 calories along with 25 grams of sugar. As I promised a little earlier, I want to touch a little more in depth on the sugar, alcohol, and GLP-1s and what we're looking at in terms of how it can impact you and why we want to be careful, aside from just the very obvious. So the added sugars in drinks, we've talked before about having blood sugar spikes, and that can cause also the blood sugar crashes, which many people can feel uncomfortable with. And it can also lead to potentially some fatigue or those blood sugar crashes that people want to avoid. Also, it has been reported where people will feel worse side effects, especially nausea, with the extra sugars. And that makes sense because that is quite a bit of sugar to be taking in all at once. Not to mention, there's probably a dessert that you've had in this evening or some other foods that may also be contributing to the sugar load. Moving on to alcohol, one obvious, maybe not so obvious, is that with reduced intake of alcohol, most likely, and also a reduction in weight, many people are going to experience a lower tolerance. So it's really important to moderate your intake because a previous tolerance that you may have had is probably not going to be there anymore. Also, alcohol is known to decrease blood sugars. And if you happen to have a history of diabetes or if you have a tendency to have low blood sugars, there is the risk of having the hypoglycemia. And alcohol, similar to sugar, with intake, higher intake, you may have stronger side effects, unpleasant side effects such as nausea and vomiting. And probably the most obvious, of course, alcohol and sugary drinks, while delicious, they are what we would call mostly empty or lower quality calories. And it's very easy to fill up on them because of that lack of satiety. It doesn't mean we can't have the occasional treat, but it is something to keep in the back of our mind. And with that in mind, I wanted to give a few options out there. So before we move on to talking about a couple recipe adjustments from the classic beverages that we touched on, here are some non-alcoholic and alcoholic drinks that are in general healthier. So for a mocktail, we could look at fresh cucumber slices plus some mint leaves and lime juice and sparkling water. Or you could have unsweetened cranberry juice and maybe a ginger kombucha. Just be careful with the sugar content on those, although they tend to be a little bit lower depending on what you pick. And in terms of a healthier alcoholic drink, the classic wine spritzer is a really good option. So wine plus sparkling water or a sugar-free lemon lime soda. Also, hard liquors plus a soda water plus fresh citrus, I believe. Vodka plus soda water and fresh citrus is known now, I believe, as ranch water, and I've heard it's very refreshing. And again, you can still feel like you're in the holiday spirit, but it is going to be lower calories in general because we're not adding a bunch of extra sugar. We're also not adding any whipped cream or creaminess. And light beer, just so you know, that is an option out there. Forgive my cat, he's interfering a little bit, but I wanted to list that as an option as well. Then, in terms of the holiday drinks, I wanted to see what we could try and make over, if at all possible. And I struggled finding anything for the hot buttered rum, but I did find something for the eggnog. In fact, I found a few options out there. And so, what I've created is sort of a combination of a couple recipes that I found so that we can see how we can just make this a little bit healthier. So you can see that we've got 3/4 of a cup of sugar versus 1/3 a cup of sugar, or if you please, you can also change it completely to a non-nutritive option such as stevia or monk fruit, which would be my top two choices there. Also, the rum and bourbon is optional. You could do to taste. And also, this is where the combination of the recipes came in. Some people found that they could also add a scoop of either vanilla or unflavored protein powder, which would really pump up the protein content. And with the protein content increased, along with the sugar content decreased, while I still wouldn't call it health food, we can definitely call it healthier if you like that taste of eggnog, which I know can be a bit polarizing for some people. In terms of mulled wine, these were almost exact with the number of ingredients and sort of the types of ingredients. So it's a bit of an easier comparison to see here. We're still looking at red wine. Drier is better. That will be a lower sugar content. So Cabernets, Pinot Noirs versus I'm perhaps a Zinfandel or the soft red that you may know from Oliver Winery if you've ever been there. That would be a bit too sweet. Then we're looking at a citrus and then adding some cloves. 12 whole cloves may be a bit overwhelming, so do it to your taste. But you can see here the main changes. This is just having wine, not having wine and brandy. And it's also decreasing the honey by an entire fourth. So rather than 4 tablespoons, so 1/4 of a cup, you're doing 1 tablespoon. So you can still get that flavor, but you're going to reduce the total sugar content. To touch on general sipping strategies for both alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks, I wanted to touch on a few mindful ones. And while this first point, don't drink on an empty stomach, makes probably the most sense for alcoholic beverages, it can also for non-alcoholic. So if you just have a very overly sweet drink and you start on that with an empty stomach, chances are you're going to feel that discomfort a little bit sooner and more quickly. And if you're feeling full from actual food, then chances are you're not going to necessarily drink quite as quickly. As I commented on that peppermint mocha, since really reducing the sugar may come with a combination of reducing the size, going from a grande to a tall, or even a short if that's an option, as well as reducing the number of syrup and sauce pumps to help reduce the sugar content. If you really like that classic drink, try and pick it for one time only, the smallest portion you can, and that's your special treat, rather than having multiple of them during the time. Also, be sure to pace yourself. Alternate whatever treat drink you have with water, even if it's a healthier alcoholic drink or a healthier mocktail. Alternating with water is one, going to help you maintain that hydration that we're looking for, but it can also help from overindulging in too many calories or too much alcohol. And be sure to take your time. There's no rush. And if you can sip slowly and savor it throughout the evening, chances are that no one's going to try and top you off or offer you another beverage if you've already got one in hand. But make sure that you can stop if you start feeling uncomfortable. If you feel like you are hitting your limit, then it's best to just stop altogether and focus on water. And ideally, you would stop before you start to feel this way. So that's another reason to go slowly and see how you feel, especially if you think that your tolerance might be greatly reduced. I did also want to touch on just general traffic light guide for drinks. You may know most of these, but just so you have that on hand. So green or go, what you want to make sure to focus on are water, sparkling water, unsweetened teas, unsweetened coffee. Yellow would be maybe diet drinks, especially if you're concerned about how non-nutritive sweeteners may affect you, but also the healthier alcoholic drinks because you do want to limit those. And then the drinks that you would like to avoid and limit as much as possible would be, say, regular soda, those fancy coffees, the creamy cocktails, so not only like an eggnog, but maybe a White Russian, and general overindulgence of alcohol. And for some goals for the week, I would say, there's many healthier holiday drink recipes out there. I was able to find a few, and I do have some links to them at the end. So try out one of those recipes, see what you like, see what you don't like. What kind of changes are you able and willing to make where you can still enjoy the beverage for what it is? Or start alternating, practicing that 1-to-1 ratio. If staying hydrated or focusing on drinking water has been a challenge for you, this would be the time to really start implementing that and seeing what you can do. And there are some people who have mentioned that there's a struggle when out in a crowd or with friends and family, that there's almost that pressure to continue drinking. And practice that no, thank you, I'm fine with water, and get comfortable with being able to say it. Also, I have heard some tricks from people are to simply add a slice of a lime in your water. And for whatever reason, that can give people the impression that you're not just drinking water. And perhaps that can reduce any potential pressure that you would get. So to tie this all together in a neat holiday bow, just remember that holiday drinks, they really can be sneaky with calories, sugar, alcohol. It's sort of a trifecta. But it is possible to still enjoy mindfully. You can either try and swap out some ingredients like we talked about, or just have less of the real thing. And as always, in these cases or in any case throughout the year, always prioritize hydration. That will help keep your overall health, maintain your metabolism, and get those GLP-1 medications really working for you. And with that, here are my sources, just so you can see that there's some recipes here. Of course, I will be happy to share this. If you want to have access to these recipes, feel free to either take a screenshot or contact the Premier staff. We can make sure to get this to you so you can have those recipes. And also, these were some citations in regards to that report of decreased alcohol intake or desire. And now I will leave it open for questions if you have any about this or other nutrition topics. So feel free to hit that question mark at the bottom of the screen, and I will wait here for a few moments and see if anyone has any questions for me. All right. And with that, I would say that concludes our evening. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you found this informative and helpful and maybe inspired you a little bit on some recipes to try, or maybe find a recipe and share with us, because I'm always happy to hear about new recipes to try out and also recommend to others. I hope you have a lovely evening, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.